주의 하신 예수분 우바우치 오늘이나 베승하돌라마로션 베승하돌라마로션 사성 베승하야 세구 사성 베승하야 세구
This is chickpeas. That's beautiful.
Oh, wow.
수야건 에라나파 사성 베승하야 세구
50 days after the resurrection of Jesus, Jews from the lands all around the eastern Mediterranean were gathering in great excitement to celebrate their ancient Festival of Weeks in Jerusalem. It would have been a truly joyous occasion, just as the Jewish Bar Mitzvah celebrations are in the Holy City today. The vast throng had gathered from an enormous area around the Mediterranean, a truly multicultural crowd. And this was the opportunity chosen by God to pour out his Spirit on his first disciples, giving them the power to announce the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And this in the very city which had crucified him only 50 days earlier. Peter's astounding message to the enormous crowd was, "You killed him, God raised him, we are witnesses." And about 3,000 were deeply convicted and believed his message. They will be returning to their various lands as the very first believers in Jesus, as the Jewish Messiah and as the Son of God. Some of them would be making their way home to the extraordinary land of Cappadocia. Driving through Cappadocia is like travelling back in time. This is the land of the Hittites. They established their empire here about 1600 BC. The astounding fairy chimneys are one of the world's most stunning sights. This landscape was created about 13 million years ago when erupting volcanoes blanketed the region with ash. The ash solidified into an easily eroded material called tufa, overlaid in places by layers of hard volcanic rock. Over time, the tufa was worn away, creating these distinctive formations, including the capped cone fairy chimneys. So it was to this remarkable land that some of its residents returned from Jerusalem as some of the earliest believers in Jesus as the Jewish Messiah and the Son of God. But back at Jerusalem, not everyone shared their faith. One of the believers' fiercest opponents was Saul, later known by his Roman name of Paul. He was a strictly religious Jew, brought up to observe the requirements of the law in the most intimate detail. Today, at Jerusalem's famous Western Wall, the intensity of Jewish prayers and rituals provides a dramatic insight into the intensity of Paul himself. He knew that this Jesus had been crucified for claiming to be the Messiah. And now his followers were claiming that God had raised him from the dead in dramatic confirmation that he was indeed the Messiah. To Paul, such a fervent Jew, it was intolerable. How could this Jesus be the long-awaited Messiah? His tomb was certainly empty. Everyone in Jerusalem knew that. The stone had been rolled away and the body gone. But it was all a massive deception by his disciples, surely. They had doubtless stolen his body and were now claiming he was alive. What's more, many thousands were believing them. This deceit would be spreading ever further. It must be halted at all costs. One of Jesus' followers had already been stoned to death. Stephen, the very first Christian martyr. As the rocks rained down on him, Stephen prayed, "Lord, don't hold this sin against them." And Saul was present to see him die. He, for one, could never forget it. Stephen's death triggered a great persecution. Several of the believers had to flee for their lives, many as far as Damascus. So Saul set off in hot pursuit, determined to destroy this new movement. So out of the city and across the Kidron Valley, past the Garden of Gethsemane. Oh my word, this was where Jesus had been arrested. The whole city knew all about that. And then on up to the top of the Mount of Olives. Time for a last long lingering look at Jerusalem behind him. The road now tumbled down through the awesome Judean wilderness to the bottom of the great Rift Valley, the lowest place on earth, nearly 1,400 feet or 423 metres below sea level. The temperature soars, and so did Saul's anger.
They thought they could escape him, did they? Little did they know that he was after them. But then, could it be that someone might be after him?
Ah, he's arrived at Jericho, the city of palm trees, set in its lush oasis with the Judean wilderness all around. But, oh no, it was from here that Jesus had set out for Jerusalem on his fateful visit. They'd turned against him pretty quickly when he'd invited himself to the home of the most hated man in town, Jericho's chief tax collector, Zacchaeus,
The man who worked for the hated Romans and had defrauded just about everyone in town. Well, didn't that just go to show what rogues these followers of Jesus were? Just like their master. Risen from the dead, had he? Well, if that tomb was empty, his followers must have spirited away his corpse somewhere. No wonder they were still at it. But not for very much longer. He, Saul, was personally going to put an end to this matter, once and for all.
Where next? Ah, yes, Beit Abara, the crossing point on the Jordan. It's here that great crowds had flocked to hear the great preacher from the wilderness who'd caused such a stir. John the Baptizer, they'd called him. Thousands had flocked to hear him. The chief priests had even had to send out messengers to ask him who he thought he was.
Are you the Messiah, they'd asked? No, he'd answered. But someone's coming after me who's far greater than I. I'm here to prepare the way for the Lord.
So in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens opened and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "Thou art my beloved Son. With thee I am well pleased." And so this was where he'd actually baptized this Jesus. Here today, where the Jordan used to flow, steps from the earliest churches lead down to this never-to-be-forgotten site. The very first church on these pillars actually spanned the river itself. So this is a site where the ministry of Jesus began.
There was just no getting round it. There was no escaping this Jesus. Every mile of Saul's journey was rooted in memories of him. Almost as if Jesus was dogging his steps, you might say.
Up north now towards Galilee, and there's its glorious lake. But, oh dear, the whole life of Jesus had revolved around this lake, hadn't it? He had called his first disciples on its shores, and great crowds had flocked to hear him on its surrounding hills. Which route around the lake did Saul take? We're not told. If he went west, he'd have passed Tabgha, where even today its church commemorates how Jesus fed the 5,000 with just 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Its famous mosaic is a small, simple but eloquent testimony to the miracle which took place. If Saul had taken the eastern shore, he'd have heard how a great crowd of 4,000 had spent 3 days there with Jesus in these hills, enthralled by his teaching. He had fed them with just 7 loaves and a few fish. A few miles further on, they'd all have been telling him of how this Jesus had driven evil spirits out of a man. He'd sent them into a herd of pigs who had all rushed over the cliffs and drowned in the lake. Jesus didn't seem so popular there. In fact, they'd told him to go away. If only he could shake these memories of Jesus from him.
Ah, he's nearly at the top of the lake now. Peace at last. But, oh no, it's Capernaum, the home of that man Peter.
Why, Jesus had made this fishing town the centre of his Galilean ministry for nearly 3 whole years. Just about everything had happened here. The stories were endless. It's here in Peter's house that Jesus had claimed to have the authority to forgive sins, something only God could do. Sheer blasphemy. No wonder he had had to be crucified. That wretched Jairus, the very ruler of the synagogue. The whole town was emphatic that Jesus had raised his daughter from the dead. Saul couldn't have got out of the town quick enough. The memories of Jesus would be suffocating him.
So off he sets, leaving Capernaum and the lakeside far behind and heading north towards the city of Caesarea Philippi on the very foothills of Mount Hermon.
Beneath these towering cliffs, the melted snows of Mount Hermon flow out of the rock as a complete river, one of the sources of the River Jordan. This unusual natural phenomenon had caused this place to be a centre of pagan religion from earliest times. And it was here that Jesus had come with his disciples. And at this very site, where men had worshipped their heathen deities, Jesus had asked them, "Who do you say I am?" Peter's reply was destined to ring down through the ages. "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Saul would have shuddered at such a reply. But today's visitors, in remembering this event, find the reply of Jesus to Simon Peter very telling. "Blessed are you, Simon, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." So here, at one of the sources of the River Jordan, Simon Peter had been granted a revelation as to the true identity of Jesus. But would a similar revelation ever be granted to Saul? He was about to set off on this, the final stage of his journey to Damascus. Little did he know it, but it was about to change his life and world history forever. Join us again for part 2. Saul's journey to Damascus is nearly over, and what a route it's been. Every place he's passed full of memories of Jesus. The Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus had been arrested. Jericho, where Jesus had healed a blind man and enabled Zacchaeus to see his life in a whole new light. The crossing point on the River Jordan, where Jesus had been baptized. And now on up to the Sea of Galilee, positively teeming with reminders of Jesus. Here he had called his first disciples as they plied their trade as fishermen. Here great crowds had flocked to hear him on these surrounding hills. There was Tabgha, where it was said that Jesus had fed a vast crowd with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And on the nearby hills, Jesus had sent evil spirits out of a man into a herd of pigs, who rushed over the steep cliffs into the lake and were drowned. And then there was Capernaum, the fishing town on the shores of the lake. So much had happened here. The stories were endless. Wherever he's gone, Saul just can't escape these reminders of Jesus. Almost as if Jesus is dogging his steps, you might say. And now he's setting off on the last leg of his journey, still breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the believers in Jesus. Risen from the dead, has he? Well, if that tomb is empty, it's because they've taken his body. He's dead, and so will they be once he gets his hands on them. Suddenly, a great flash of light, blinding, dazzling. Saul fell to the ground, and a voice.
Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do.
The men travelling with Saul heard the sound, but they did not see anyone.
So, in an instant, he had seen the risen Lord. When he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. He had to be led by the hand into Damascus. But blinded or not, now there was one thing he could see very clearly indeed, that empty tomb. So, the tomb was empty, but not because the disciples had stolen the body. No, it was empty because Jesus had risen, and he, Saul, had seen him in all the glory of heaven. That instant and that revelation were to change his life and world history forever. From that moment, he was become as bold as Peter in proclaiming the message himself. And so, after some years of deep reflection on the stupendous significance, we find him setting off with companion Barnabas on their very first missionary journey. And the very first port of call was the island of Cyprus itself. The little party arrived first on the island at the little port of Salamis, on the eastern shores of the island.
It was one of the Mediterranean's most important ports, and also the island's commercial capital.
Intriguingly, Luke gives us no indication as to how their message was received, but he certainly records that in later places they visited, their message about Jesus met with violent opposition. So we're left to wonder just what sort of reception Barnabas and Saul got here in Salamis.
Luke presses on with his narrative, relating that they travelled through the whole island until they came to Paphos. We know that Saul, or Paul as he was shortly to be known, was a great strategist. He always headed straight for centres of great significance, from where the news of Jesus could spread far and wide.
Ever on they must have trudged, for mile after weary mile, driven ever onwards to proclaim the good news about Jesus.
Until finally the climax. Paphos itself. They must have been thankful to have made it. Today, its port is more given over to pleasure, serving as a small marina and a shelter for fishermen. But in Paul's day, it was a major seaport. He must have been bursting to start preaching here.
So here they were at last. Did our weary travellers actually enter the great city of Paphos along this Roman road? This bit is still awaiting reconstruction. We can be sure that any town that comprised more than one synagogue was a thriving commercial centre. The Jews of the first century were never found in the poor places. And the ruins here in Paphos certainly confirm the city's importance.
Paul and his companions must have walked these very streets. The modern lighthouse towers over one of the city's two theatres, this one reconstructed. A delightful setting with its superb views over the plain. This magnificent mosaic of Theseus was a later addition to the house of the governor of the island, whom Paul was soon to meet right here. And here's a hypocaust, used for heating the rooms of the hot baths, so favoured by the rich Romans.
Well, so much of Roman Paphos still lies deep beneath the surface. What treasures have yet to be unearthed?
Paul had certainly chosen an enormously significant city in which to proclaim his news about Jesus. So
what sort of reception did they receive in the synagogues here? Again, tantalizingly, Luke doesn't tell us. But there is an old legend that Paul was whipped here.
this is the actual pillar to which the locals attach great importance.
In one of his letters, which he later wrote to the early believers in Corinth, he mentions how in his travels he was frequently beaten because of his preaching about Jesus. So it's perfectly possible that one of those occasions might well have occurred right here. The locals here in Paphos certainly consider that it did.
They've even named their restaurant in commemoration of it.
Well, for whatever reason, the arrival of Barnabas and Saul soon came to the attention of the Roman proconsul Sergius Paulus, and he sent for them because he wanted to hear the word of God. But while Sergius was eager to hear them, one of his attendants was not. Elymas, the sorcerer, that's what his name means, and he opposed them, and he tried to turn the proconsul from the faith. But Paul, full of the Holy Spirit, he looked straight at him and he said, "You child of the devil and an enemy of everything that is right. I know what you are. You're full of all kinds of deceit and trickery. When will you ever stop perverting the right ways of the Lord? And now the hand of the Lord is on you, and you will be blind, and for a moment or a while you will be unable to see the light of the sun." Immediately, mist and darkness came over him, and he groped around trying to find someone to lead him by the hand. When Sergius saw this, he was believed, because he was amazed at the power of the Lord. Two remarkable things happened here in Paphos as a result of this audience. From now on, it's never Barnabas and Saul, but always Paul and his party. Up to now, it had always been Saul following Barnabas as a loyal and devoted friend. But from now on, as I said, it's always Paul and his party. So why should Saul have chosen this moment to adopt his Roman name of Paul? Well, as the first representative of Jesus before a high official of Rome, he realized that Paul, the Roman citizen, a member of the ruling empire, was a far more powerful force in the world than Saul the Jew. So it was naturally as Paul that he was to face the Roman Empire. One man against the might of pagan Rome.
And so Paul and his party left Paphos and set sail for Perga on the mainland. Here John Mark left them to return home to Jerusalem. So Paul and Barnabas trekked on alone up the steep and tortuous path to the great Roman colony of Antioch in Pisidia. And we've just arrived ourselves, eager to explore. By the time Paul and Barnabas arrived here, it had been a Roman colony for about 50 years. It was established by Augustus to bring Roman law and order to the bandit-infested highlands of southern Galatia. The setting's certainly spectacular. On its hill, overlooking the plain and backed by the immense pinnacles of the Sultan Dar. The snow sometimes stays on its summits until midsummer. The city was the military capital of the Roman province of Galatia. Paul must have looked at the Roman inscriptions on the public buildings and statues with the feeling that he was nearer to Rome than he'd ever been before. He'd preached in Syria, in Cilicia and in Cyprus, but he hadn't yet done so in a Roman colony. The site's pretty extensive even today, a good indication of just how significant the city was. Paul must have immediately grasped its significance. If trade could radiate from here in all directions, so could the gospel. These ancient foundations beneath a Byzantine church may be those of the 1st century synagogue. If so, this is the site where Paul and Barnabas were first welcomed by the Jews. In fact, Paul's preaching here was so powerful that the next week almost the whole city came to hear him. So great was the response that the Orthodox Jews stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas. So somewhere right here, Paul was to make one of his most important pronouncements. We had to speak the word of God to you first, but since you reject it, we now turn to the Gentiles. In that announcement, Paul and Barnabas gave this remote hill town a position among those places in which the major events of Christianity occurred. It flung wide the door of the faith to the whole world.
Well, I hope you'll join me again soon to explore more of Paul's great adventures. In St. Paul in Greece, we'll find him boldly proclaiming the message of Jesus in the great cities there too. You can view the film free on redeemtv.com, and you'll find all the other films in my series there too.